This book explores the strengths you developed long before the digital landscape changed how everyday life works. If you're in your mid-40s or older, if you grew up in the 1960s, 1970s, or 1980s, you know what I mean. You grew up and built your adult life in a time that was often uncertain, demanding, and imperfect. There were fewer instructions, fewer safeguards, and very little reassurance along the way. When something broke, you had to figure it out. When plans failed, you adjusted. Silence was normal. Waiting was normal. Not knowing everything immediately was normal too. When I speak about the pre-digital generation, I am describing people like you. People who learned to think, adapt, and take responsibility in conditions that required real judgment and real effort. The world you lived in did not constantly guide you or explain itself. You were expected to make decisions, carry their consequences, and keep going. The goal of this book is not to look backward with simple nostalgia, and not to complain about how difficult things once were. It is also not an argument that one generation is better than another. Instead, this book is an attempt to recognize something essential: the strengths you developed because you met the challenges of your time and handled them. This book is built around 6 such strengths. They did not appear automatically, and they were not handed to you by circumstance alone. Many people lived through the same period. Not everyone emerged with these capacities. These strengths were formed through repeated action, through responsibility taken, decisions made without guarantees, and the quiet determination to make things work anyway. They do not announce themselves with slogans or demand recognition from modern systems. To you, they may feel ordinary, even unremarkable, simply because you have carried them for so long. Yet they reveal themselves in how you remain grounded when instructions are missing, how you stay oriented when rules change, and how you continue functioning when clarity disappears. You learn to carry responsibility without being praised for it. You learn to trust your own judgment in situations where there was no external approval to rely on. You became comfortable with silence, with uncertainty, and with acting without constant reassurance. In today's fully digital world, a world built on automation, instant feedback, and endless information, these strengths matter more than they appear. They keep things working when systems fail, when guidance runs out, or when complexity overwhelms simple solutions. The purpose of this journey is recognition. We will name 6 strengths you have lived with for many years and explore how they were shaped by the challenges of your time and by the way you chose to meet those challenges. These are not abstract personality traits. They are earned capacities. By the end of this book, you will not only recognize them in yourself, but understand why they matter and how to pass them forward to the generation coming after you. Chapter 1. The strengths you were never asked to name. The psychology of your childhood was described in terms of deficit rather than gift. When sociologists and psychologists looked at the latchkey kids of the 1970s and 1980s, they didn't talk about the self-reliance you were developing. They wrote about absent parents, absent supervision, and absent structure. They used words like vulnerability and abandonment. The entire culture of self-help that emerged in those decades was laser-focused on healing what was broken instead of recognizing what was being quietly built. There were no TED Talks celebrating the kids who came home to empty houses and figured out dinner. No books explained that when you spent your afternoon solving problems without calling an adult for help, you were developing something essential. Your parents weren't narrating your strengths as they emerged. They were working. Most of them were doing their best with what they had, and that survival mindset didn't leave room for celebration or explanation. You weren't told, You're becoming independent. You were just expected to function, and you did. But here's what matters. That childhood wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning. Those early patterns didn't disappear when you turned 18. They deepened, they got tested, and they matured. The world you entered as a young adult wasn't kinder or more stable than the one you'd left behind. It was different, but it required the same capacities. In your 20s and 30s, you entered the working world just as it was starting to shift. The job security your parents had known was disappearing. Companies that promised lifetime employment were laying people off. Technology was changing faster than anyone could predict. You watched the economy crash in 1987, then saw the dot-com bubble burst, erasing fortunes and entire industries. You navigated career changes that your parents' generation never imagined. And each time, you didn't wait for someone to tell you what to do. You figured it out. You adapted. You moved forward. In your 40s and 50s, something else happened. You weren't just managing your own life anymore. You were managing other people's lives too. Your children needed you, and increasingly, your aging parents required support as well. You found yourself in what people now call the sandwich generation, pulled in both directions, responsible for multiple generations simultaneously. While your parents needed help with healthcare decisions, your adult children were struggling to launch in an economy harder than the one you'd navigated. You were managing your own career while watching it become increasingly precarious. And you didn't collapse. You didn't demand that the system be fixed before you moved forward. You just adjusted. You managed. You carried it. The 2008 financial crisis hit many of you during peak earning and caregiving years. You were 40, 45, 50 years old. You had mortgages, children in college, and aging parents with healthcare costs. Suddenly, retirement savings you'd spent decades building evaporated. Job security disappeared overnight. The future became genuinely unclear. And you didn't panic. You've lived through uncertainty before. You knew how to adjust. You knew how to persist without knowing exactly how things would turn out. Now you're navigating a different kind of world. Technology has transformed everything. The pandemic happened, something no one predicted. The economy remains unstable. Your industry might be disrupted by AI or some other force you can't control. And still, you're functioning. You're still solving problems. You're still adapting. This is why it matters that it wasn't just childhood. The foundation was built when you came home to an empty house, but the structure was built across decades of living. Every time you faced something you weren't prepared for, you drew on those early lessons. Every time the world shifted beneath you, you adapted because you'd already learned that the world is always shifting. Every time someone asked you to do something without a roadmap, you didn't panic because you'd already learned how to navigate without one. So let me paint the picture of who you became, not just as a child, but across your entire adult life. You grew up in a world without instant answers. When you were young, you learned to approach problems by thinking, testing, and observing. That wasn't just a childhood skill. It became your thinking style. In your career, when new technology arrived, and it kept arriving, you didn't demand training. You figured it out and played around with it, breaking things only to fix them. You became comfortable with learning through doing, which is different from learning through instruction. Most of your younger colleagues expected step-by-step guidance. You just needed access to the tool and the room to experiment. That made you adaptable in ways they weren't. That made you valuable in ways they couldn't understand. You grew up in a world where responsibility had no audience. You did what needed to be done because it was necessary, not because anyone was watching. That didn't end when you left home. It became your work ethic. You could produce quality work without constant feedback. Managing projects became possible without needing recognition. And you carried responsibilities that would paralyze someone who only knows how to work for approval. In a culture increasingly obsessed with validation, you were already immune. You did the work because it was right, not because it would look good. You grew up comfortable being alone. That didn't mean you became isolated. It meant you developed an internal life that didn't depend on constant connection. In adulthood, that became a superpower that nobody named. When your industry required deep focus and complex thinking, you could do it. You could sit with a problem for hours without needing distraction. Making decisions based on your own judgment became standard. You could disagree with a group because your sense of self wasn't built on constant approval. You became the kind of person who could actually think. You grew up in a world of uncertainty. Plans changed, systems failed. Nothing was guaranteed. You learned early that you couldn't wait for clarity to arrive before moving forward. That capacity matured across your adult life. The 1987 crash taught you something, then the dot-com bust taught you more. Later, the 2008 crisis deepened it further. By the time you were in your 40s and 50s, you had decades of proof that life doesn't announce itself. Rules change, certainty never arrives. But you do. You keep functioning. You keep adapting. You keep moving forward. You grew up skeptical of promises. You observed adults make guarantees that didn't materialize and watched systems fail. That childhood skepticism didn't soften. It hardened into wisdom. In your career, you could see through hype. You weren't seduced by the latest management trend or the disruptive startup that promised to change everything. You were the one asking, but does it actually work? While everyone else was caught up in the excitement. That made you boring to some people and invaluable to others. The ones running organizations that actually functioned knew to listen to you. And you grew up knowing that you had to carry what was yours to carry. Your family life wasn't wealthy, nor was your childhood easy. That taught you something about what you're capable of. In adulthood, as responsibilities multiplied, you didn't look for someone to rescue you. You adjusted, worked harder, and managed to hold everything together. When your parents needed help, you didn't tell them their problems were too big. You figured out how to be there for them while managing everything else. When your children struggled, you didn't say it was their generation's job to solve their own problems. You helped them while still building your own life. You became the person that other people could count on because you'd already proven to yourself that you could handle more than you thought possible. These aren't childhood strengths that you outgrew. They're capacities that were seeded in childhood, tested across your entire adult life, and refined by decades of real experience. They're not abstract ideas. They're proven abilities. You've demonstrated them again and again, in circumstances large and small, often without recognizing that what you were doing was remarkable. Nobody has ever really celebrated this or asked you to name it. The culture didn't build a framework for understanding what you became. Your children grew up in a different world, one with more guidance and more recognition. Younger generations got taught about their strengths and encouraged to build their identities around them. You just lived yours. You carried it quietly. And because nobody pointed it out, you might have never fully recognized it. But I'm asking you to recognize it now. This is not nostalgia for a harder time, nor is it bitterness about the lack of help. It is clarity about who you actually are. You are defined by what you chose to do with what happened to you. You didn't just survive. You became capable. You became reliable. You became the kind of person that systems depend on, even when you're not the loudest voice in the room. Chapter 2. You learned to figure things out without instructions. There was a moment in 1983 when a high school student in America sat down at a computer for the first time. The student had no manual. The teacher had given up explaining it. There was just the machine and 8 hours of curiosity. By the end of that afternoon, the kid had figured out how to create an animation. Not because anyone taught him, but because he paid attention to how the machine worked, tested things, failed, adjusted, and persisted until something clicked. That kid wasn't special. He was just someone whose brain had been trained since childhood to approach the unknown by observing and experimenting, rather than by following instructions someone else had written. This is what I want you to understand. The way you think about problems is fundamentally different from the way most people think about them now. And that difference matters more than you realize. It's not just that you have a skill. It's that your brain learned to process uncertainty in a particular way. And that way of processing has stayed with you across your entire life. When something breaks, let's say the kitchen faucet starts leaking, most people today have a response ready-made. They Google it. They find a YouTube video. They follow step-by-step instructions. If the video isn't perfectly clear, or if their situation is slightly different from the one in the video, they pause. They wait. They ask someone. They don't proceed without knowing exactly what to do. This isn't laziness. It's the way their brains have been trained to work. Find the instruction, follow it, execute. Success, you do something different. When something breaks, your mind goes quiet and observational. You look at it. You notice things. How is the water coming out? What's changed from before? You think about how water gets to a faucet, the pipes, the connections, the pressure. You form a hypothesis about what might be wrong. You try something. Maybe it works. Maybe it makes it worse. Either way, you learn something. You adjust. You try again. You're not following instructions someone wrote for someone else's generic faucet. You're thinking about this faucet, this situation, this actual problem in front of you. That's not just a practical difference. It's a neurological difference, and here's why it matters. When you learn by doing, when you form a hypothesis and test it against reality, you're building something called procedural memory. Your brain isn't just storing information like a file in a cabinet. It's creating neural pathways through repeated problem solving. Your prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain that handles decision-making and planning under uncertainty, literally wires itself to be comfortable with ambiguity. Research on neuroplasticity shows that brains trained to solve problems without step-by-step guidance develop stronger adaptive capacity. They get better at pattern recognition because they've had to notice subtle differences between situations. They stop panicking when they don't know the answer because they've proven to themselves hundreds of times that not knowing is a starting point, not an ending point. Your brain learned early that uncertainty is not a problem to solve. It's a starting condition. This shows up in your work in ways you probably don't consciously notice. Someone brings you a situation that's never happened before. A client with an unusual problem or a system that's broken in a way nobody expected. Most people want information first. They want to understand the problem completely before they take action. They want someone with experience in this exact situation to tell them what to do. You ask questions, yes, but you're comfortable starting to work on it while you're still learning what it is. You observe, you adjust, you move forward. You're not waiting for complete information because you've learned, through actual experience, that complete information never comes. Action generates information. That's something you know in your bones. Your younger colleagues sometimes find this approach frustrating. They want you to explain the process, to map out the steps, to tell them the right way to do it, the proven way, the way that someone with experience has already figured out. But you can't always do that, because there is no predetermined right way. There's just the actual situation in front of you and the need to respond to it intelligently. So you do the thing, and you learn as you go, and somehow it works out. To them, it looks like you're winging it, being reckless, not following best practices. What's actually happening is that your brain has learned a particular kind of wisdom: how to be confident while uncertain. Not arrogantly confident, but grounded in the knowledge that you've faced uncertainty before, and you figured it out. This capacity is why you're valuable in situations where the roadmap doesn't exist yet. When an industry is shifting and nobody has done what needs to be done before. When a crisis happens and the normal rules don't apply. When the future is unclear and the only way forward is to pay attention to what's actually happening and respond to it with your best judgment. You don't panic. You get curious. You observe. You adjust. You move. Most people are terrified of this state. They want someone to tell them the right answer. They want to know that their approach has been validated by experts or by successful people who did it before. You're different. You've learned, not intellectually, but through your actual brain structure, that certainty doesn't come first. Action comes first. Uncertainty is the normal state. You move, you learn, you adjust. That's the only real way forward in a world that's always changing. The irony is that this capacity has become more valuable as the world has become more unpredictable, not less. When everything was stable and predictable, you could have built your career just fine following instructions. But that world doesn't exist anymore. The world now demands the exact thing your brain learned how to do. Move through uncertainty, generate information through action, adjust on the fly, and keep functioning. You probably don't think of yourself as someone with a rare and valuable skill. You think of it as just how you operate. That's precisely why you don't see it. But when you compare yourself to people who are trained differently, who expect the steps to be laid out before they move, who panic when there's no instruction manual, then you see it. You see that you have something they don't. You have the neurological architecture to thrive in chaos. And here's what I want you to see. This isn't a personality trait. It's not something you were born with or something that's unique to you. It's something your brain learned how to do, which means it's real. It's proven. It's been tested thousands of times in your actual life. You can trust it. And more than that, you can recognize it as actual strength. Chapter 3. You can be responsible without being praised. There's a moment that happens in most childhoods, but you might not remember it as significant because it felt ordinary. You come home from school, the house is empty, your parent is at work, you're hungry. There's no one to tell you what to do, no one to prepare food, no one to make sure you're okay. So you look in the cupboard. You find bread, butter, something to eat. You make yourself lunch. You do your homework. You feed yourself dinner if needed. You put yourself to bed. Maybe you babysit a younger sibling, or you handle a small crisis, a cut, a scraped knee, something that scared you, without being able to call for help. Nobody praised you for this. Nobody said, "What a responsible child you are." Nobody documented it on social media or told you that you were developing character. You just did it because it had to be done. The house didn't run itself. The work didn't do itself. You were the only one there, so you were the one who did it. That experience, repeated thousands of times across your childhood, built something specific in you. It created a different relationship to responsibility than most people have now. And it's not just a psychological difference. It's neurological. In today's parenting culture, responsibility is a performance. Parents create systems to teach children responsibility. They assign chores and give rewards. They use charts and sticker systems. They document growth on social media. Responsibility becomes something you do in order to get recognition, approval, or a tangible reward. The child learns, if I do this responsible thing, I will be acknowledged for it. I will receive something in return. Good grades get praise. Cleaning the room gets a reward. The brain learns to expect external validation. You learn something different. Responsibility wasn't a performance for an audience. It was simply the condition of your life. You were responsible because no one else was going to do it. There was no audience, no reward, no acknowledgement coming. You did what needed to be done because it needed to be done. That was the entire reason. And something happened in your brain when you learned this repeatedly. Responsibility became intrinsic. It became part of how you moved through the world, not something external that you did to get approval. This distinction matters more than you might think. Neuroscientists and psychologists have spent decades studying what's called self-determination theory, pioneered by researchers Edward Deci and Richard Ryan. Their fundamental discovery was this: there are two fundamentally different types of motivation, and they activate your brain in different ways. When people are motivated externally by praise, reward, recognition, grades, their brains activate the ventral striatum, the reward center. That activation feels good in the moment. The brain releases dopamine when the reward arrives. But here's the critical finding. Over time, external rewards can actually weaken intrinsic motivation. In one landmark study, researchers observed how parents praised their children between ages 1 and 3. They tracked two types of praise: person praise, you're so smart, and process praise, you worked really hard. Then they followed these children for years. The results were striking. Children who received predominantly process praise, who were praised for effort and strategies, went on to have higher motivation, better academic performance, and more resilience when facing challenges. They believed ability was malleable. They attributed success to hard work. They sought out challenges. They generated strategies for improvement. Children who received predominantly person praise, who were told they were smart or talented, did the opposite. They adopted what researchers call an entity mindset. They believed abilities were fixed. When they faced setbacks, they gave up more easily. They avoided challenges. Why? Because if you're smart, you should be able to do things easily. When things get hard, you must not actually be smart. So you quit. The mechanism is straightforward. When a child expects a reward for doing something, their brain learns to do it for the reward. The external motivation crowds out the internal one. But when a child does something with no reward expected, their brain builds intrinsic motivation. The satisfaction comes from within. The activation happens in the anterior insula and prefrontal cortex, the parts of your brain associated with self-directed behavior and meaning-making. That's sustainable in a way that praise-seeking never is. You grew up in a world where this distinction didn't matter because there was no praise to expect. Your brain had no choice but to develop intrinsic motivation. You did things because they needed to be done. Full stop. And that built something that researchers have found to be profoundly valuable: You learn to work for the inherent satisfaction of doing things well, not for external recognition. This shows up in how you work. You can produce quality work without constant feedback. You don't need your boss to tell you that you did a good job. You know if you did the work well. You can feel it. You can see it. That's enough. You can complete a project knowing that it's done right, even if nobody celebrates it. You can maintain standards in situations where no one is checking. You're not looking for an audience. You're looking for the work to be done well. A manager once told me about an employee like you. This person had been at the company for 20 years. They never asked for promotions. They didn't speak up in meetings about their accomplishments. They just came in, did their job meticulously, and left. When this manager inherited the team, they assumed this person wasn't ambitious or engaged. Then they actually looked at the work. It was perfect. The systems this person had built were so well designed that they ran smoothly without constant oversight. When the manager asked why they'd never promoted themselves, this person looked confused. They said, "The work needed to be done. I did it. That's what I do." The manager realized they had someone invaluable, someone who didn't need recognition to do excellent work. This makes you rare in a culture obsessed with recognition. Most people now have been trained their entire lives to expect feedback. Gold stars, grades, social media likes, performance reviews, acknowledgement. When they do something well and nobody notices, something in them deflates. They wonder if anyone cares. They might post about it themselves, looking for validation from their network. But you're different. You can do something that matters without needing anyone to tell you it matters. You already know. Researchers studying motivation have found that this capacity to work without external validation is directly linked to what's called autonomous extrinsic motivation. This is when you do something that's externally necessary, like your job, but you do it because you've internalized the value of it. You're doing it because you believe the work matters. Your brain has learned to regulate itself from the inside out, not from the outside in. In your career, this has meant something significant. You can maintain systems that work so smoothly that no one notices they're working. Because when something works, people don't think about it. Systems that work are invisible. Only broken systems get attention. You can do the unglamorous work that keeps organizations functional while other people are focused on getting credit for visible accomplishments. And you're okay with that. You're more than okay with it. You're the one the organization depends on. This doesn't mean you don't care about recognition. You're human. Appreciation is nice. But it means you're not dependent on it. Your sense of accomplishment comes from within, not from external validation. You know the difference between doing something that looks good and doing something that actually works. And you'll choose what actually works every time, even if it means fewer likes, fewer compliments, fewer acknowledgments. The work is good. That's what matters. Think about what this means in your personal life. Your parents, as they age, need care. You help them. You manage their appointments, their medications, their financial decisions. You coordinate with siblings or make decisions alone. You do this week after week, month after month, sometimes for years. Nobody is throwing you a party for being a good child. Society doesn't celebrate elder care the way it celebrates some other things. There's no applause in the waiting room at the doctor's office while you're managing your parents' healthcare decisions. There's just the work and the weight of responsibility. But you do it because your parent is your responsibility. They raised you. Now they need you. That's enough reason. Your children, as they launch into adulthood, still need things from you sometimes. Financial help, emotional support, practical assistance. A 30-year-old child going through a divorce might need to stay with you for a few months. An adult child struggling with a job search might need financial help while they figure things out. You provide it because they're your children, and that's what you do. Responsibility without expectation of return. Responsibility for its own sake. This is not a small thing. This is increasingly rare. Most people now, especially younger people, have been trained to see relationships as exchanges. You do something, you expect something back. You help, you expect gratitude. But you learn that some responsibilities are simply yours to carry. You carry them because they're yours, because that's what it means to be someone that other people can count on. In the workplace, this shows up as reliability. You're the person people can depend on because you've internalized responsibility as a core part of who you are. You'll solve the problem even if no one acknowledges it. You'll come in early to handle a crisis that nobody even knows about. You do it because you do it, because the work matters and you're responsible for it. Your younger colleagues sometimes find this confusing. They want you to make sure everyone knows about your contributions so you can get the raise or the promotion. They see you doing excellent work without demanding recognition, and they think you're being taken advantage of. But you're not wired that way. You did the work. It's done. That's enough. The work speaks for itself, or it doesn't. But either way, you're not going to spend energy promoting it. You've already moved on to the next thing that needs to be done. The research backs this up. Studies on intrinsic motivation and job satisfaction show that people who have internalized responsibility, who do things because they matter, not because they'll be rewarded, tend to have higher job satisfaction, lower burnout rates, and more sustainable careers. They're not constantly looking for the next promotion or the next validation. They're satisfied by the work itself. That's a form of freedom that money can't buy. It's also increasingly rare, which makes it increasingly valuable. And here's what I want you to see. You didn't choose to be this way. You were shaped by circumstances. You grew up in a world where responsibility had no audience. So you learned to be responsible for its own sake. But the result is that you became something valuable. You became someone that other people can actually trust, not just in the public moments, but in the moments when no one is looking. When the only reward is knowing that you did the right thing. That's not something everyone knows how to be. But you do, and you have. For a long time, through circumstances large and small, visible and invisible, celebrated and completely unacknowledged. You've been responsible. And that responsibility, built into your bones, into your brain, into the way you move through the world, is actual strength. Chapter 4. You're comfortable being on your own. Solitude was simply the texture of your childhood. You weren't scheduled into activities every afternoon. There was no organized soccer practice, no music lessons, no summer camp unless your parents could afford it. You had free time, unstructured, unsupervised, undocumented time. You spent it alone. Maybe you were outside, in the woods or the creek behind your house, just exploring. Or you were inside with a book, or drawing supplies, or a project you'd invented. Or you were building something in the garage, fixing your bicycle, experimenting with whatever caught your curiosity. The hours stretched. Time moved differently. Nobody was tracking what you were doing, or documenting it, or telling you to be more productive. You were just alone with yourself. For many people now, that sounds like deprivation. The cultural narrative has shifted so completely that unsupervised childhood alone time is now considered a form of neglect. Children are supposed to be in activities. They're supposed to have constant engagement. When a child is alone, parents feel they should do something about it. But something different happened to you in that solitude. You didn't become lonely. You became yourself. This is what researchers studying social development call a critical distinction. There is loneliness, which is a painful emotional state. The feeling of disconnection, of being separate from others when you want to be connected. And then there is solitude, which is a choice or a circumstance of being alone, but not necessarily feeling isolated. You learned that being alone didn't have to hurt. It could be where you figured out who you were. In solitude, you developed an internal life that wasn't dependent on reflection from other people. You learned who you were when nobody was watching. You could just exist. And in that existence, you developed preferences, thoughts, curiosities that were purely yours. Research on personality development shows something important. The psychologist Carl Jung called it individuation, the process of becoming yourself, of developing a self that's independent of what other people expect or want from you. This process typically happens in late adolescence or early adulthood. But it happens faster and more deeply in people who spent significant time alone during childhood. When you have to entertain yourself, when you have to figure out what you like and what matters to you without external guidance, you develop a stronger, clearer sense of self. Neuroscientifically, this relates to what's called the default mode network in your brain. When you're not engaged with external stimuli, when you're not scrolling, watching, listening to something, your brain activates its default mode network. This is when your brain does its deepest processing. Daydreaming, reflection, self-awareness, memory consolidation, planning, moral reasoning. These all happen in the default mode network. People who spend more time in activities that engage their default mode network develop stronger self-awareness, more robust sense of identity, and better capacity for self-regulation. You spent thousands of hours activating your default mode network. You had time to think about things deeply, to wonder, to daydream, to process your life without constant interruption. Your sense of self had room to develop and solidify. This shows up in how you relate to other people now. You don't need constant connection to feel okay. You can sit in silence with someone without feeling the need to fill it with talking. You can go a day without checking your phone without feeling anxious. You can be at a gathering where you don't know many people, and you're not immediately trying to network or make friends or prove yourself. You're comfortable with your own company. This makes you rare in a digitally connected world. Most people now, especially younger people, have been raised with constant connectivity. They got their first smartphone in elementary school. They've been performing their lives on social media since childhood. They've never had to develop an internal life because they've always had an external audience. The consequence is measurable. Rates of anxiety and depression among young people have skyrocketed. Loneliness is epidemic. People report feeling more connected than ever while actually feeling more isolated than ever. Why? Because they never developed the capacity to be alone without being lonely. They never built the internal resources that come from solitude. They never learned to trust their own company. You did. And you probably didn't realize it was a gift. Think about what this means in practical terms. When you face a difficult decision, you can sit with it. You don't need to immediately call someone and process it out loud. You don't panic when you have to make a choice alone. You've been sitting with complex thoughts your whole life. When you're in a difficult relationship situation, you don't immediately turn to your friends to get their perspective. You can think about it yourself first. You can consider what you actually feel and what you actually want before you invite other people's opinions. You have a self that exists independent of group consensus. When you're at work and facing a problem that requires deep, focused thinking, you can do it. You can close the door or put your headphones on and go deep. You can spend hours working on something complex without needing breaks for stimulation or connection. You can focus because you've spent your whole life practicing the ability to be alone with a task. This capacity has become genuinely unusual. In workplaces and in life generally, people are increasingly unable to focus. They need constant stimulation. The ability to spend hours in deep, undistracted work is becoming rarer, and it's becoming more valuable. But there's something deeper than just productivity. There's authenticity. When you develop a self in solitude, that self doesn't depend on group approval. Other people might disagree with you. You might be in the minority opinion. But it doesn't destabilize you because your sense of self didn't come from consensus. It came from your own thinking, your own observation, your own values. This is different from being stubborn or contrarian. It's not that you're determined to disagree with people. It's that you developed your own perspective before you had to fit into groups, so your perspective has roots. A study by psychologist Jonathan Cheek and colleagues on solitude and personality found that people who regularly engage in solitude, who spend time alone by choice, not out of isolation, have higher levels of what they call internal reference frames. This means you look to yourself for guidance about what's right, what matters, who you are. You don't look primarily to external sources like media, trends, or group opinion. This is correlated with higher autonomy, better mental health outcomes, and more genuine relationships. Genuine relationships, yes. Because when you know who you are, you can actually show up as yourself in relationships. You're just there, authentically, as yourself. And that makes you trustworthy. That makes relationships with you meaningful. Your younger colleagues or even your adult children sometimes seem envious of this capacity. They'll say something like, "I wish I could be okay with just being alone." They treat it like a mysterious trait they don't understand. But it's not mysterious. You learned it. You spent time alone. You got comfortable with yourself. And now you can access yourself. There's a particular kind of peace that comes from being comfortable with your own company. It's not loneliness. It's autonomy. It's the freedom to think your own thoughts and feel your own feelings without needing someone else's perspective to validate them. You can sit with sadness without needing to talk about it. You can sit with uncertainty without needing someone to tell you what to do. This is becoming increasingly valuable in a world that's constantly trying to tell you what to think, what to feel, what to want. When everything around you is designed to grab your attention and influence your opinion, having an internal life that's separate from that noise is a form of freedom. Having a self that existed before social media and still exists independent of it, that's power. And here's something important. Being comfortable with solitude doesn't mean you're antisocial and you don't value relationships or connection. It means you can be in relationships from a place of wholeness, not neediness. You can spend time with people because you want to, not because you're anxious about being alone. You can leave a gathering when you need to without feeling guilty. You can say no to social commitments without feeling like you're missing out. You have a center of gravity inside yourself, not in other people's opinions. This is rare. Most people are seeking that center of gravity in external sources, in likes, in followers, in approval, in the validation of their social circle. You already found it inside yourself, decades ago, in the quiet hours of your childhood. And you never lost it. That's not something you should take for granted. and it's not something you should apologize for when you're with people who don't understand it. Your comfort with solitude isn't a character flaw. It's a form of psychological maturity that most people are desperately trying to develop and struggling to find. You already have it. You've had it for a long time. It was built in the alone time of your childhood, strengthened across your adult life, and it's one of the things that makes you genuinely yourself. Chapter 5. You don't panic when life gets unclear. September 2008. The financial world collapsed in ways that felt catastrophic and permanent. People who had spent their entire adult lives following the rules, saving money consistently, investing wisely, building equity, suddenly watched those rules become worthless. The stock market crashed. Home values evaporated overnight. Companies that seemed stable declared bankruptcy. Jobs disappeared without warning. The future that had seemed secure suddenly became terrifyingly unclear. For many people, this wasn't just a financial crisis. It was a crisis of confidence, a psychological breakdown of everything they believed about how the world worked. How do you move forward when the guidance you've been following turns out to be wrong? How do you make decisions when the people who were supposed to know what they were doing clearly didn't? How do you plan for a future that refuses to stay planned? Your generation had a different response because you'd been here before. Not literally. Each crisis is unique in its details. But neurologically and psychologically, you'd already learned how to move through uncertainty. You'd learned that the rules change. This capacity didn't come from nowhere. It came from living through multiple disruptions across your entire life, each one teaching you something that stuck. You came of age in the 1980s and 1990s, when the world was shifting beneath everyone's feet. Your parents' generation had experienced job security in ways you never would. They could work at a company for 40 years and retire with a pension and health insurance. But by the time you entered the workforce, that was already becoming impossible. Companies were restructuring constantly. Manufacturing was moving overseas. The economy was becoming more volatile. You watched your parents navigate these changes, some losing jobs they thought were secure, some retraining mid-career. The certainty they'd built their lives around turned out to be an illusion. So you learned something early that stuck with you. The rules can change. The safe path can disappear. The future you thought you'd have might not materialize. That's not pessimism. That's pattern recognition based on actual observation of how the world actually works. Then came the late 1990s and the dot-com boom. Everyone was talking about the internet. Everyone was investing in startups. The entire economy was going to be transformed. The old rules of business no longer applied. Growth was all that mattered. Profitability was irrelevant. Companies with no earnings traded at astronomical valuations. People quit secure jobs to work at promising startups. It felt inevitable. It felt like the future. And then, in 2001, it collapsed. Thousands of companies evaporated. People who had quit secure jobs suddenly had nothing. The future that had seemed certain turned out to be a bubble. You learned something deeper this time. What sounds good and what actually works are not the same thing. Big promises don't guarantee outcomes. Certainty is always an illusion. Then came the early 2000s, a period where people felt safer. The economy recovered. People felt like things were stable again. Then came 2008. By then you were in your 40s. You had mortgages. You had children in school or approaching college. You had aging parents. You had retirement savings you'd spent years carefully building. And suddenly, the entire financial system seized up. Lehman Brothers, Bear Stearns, the auto industry, everything seemed to be collapsing at once. People who had done everything right, saved consistently, invested prudently, bought homes as they were told to, watched their net worth evaporate. This time your response was different. You'd already learned the lesson twice, so you didn't panic. You didn't freeze waiting for the experts to fix things. You looked at what you could actually control and you adjusted it. Some of you found freelance work. Some of you shifted careers entirely. Some of you cut expenses radically. Some of you took on additional income streams. You didn't wait for certainty to return. You moved forward in the uncertainty. Neuroscience research on stress and decision-making shows something important about how your brain works differently now. When people face acute stress or uncertainty, their amygdala, the brain's fear center, activates. This is useful if you need to run from a physical threat. But it's counterproductive when you need to make complex decisions. The amygdala activation narrows your thinking. It makes you more reactive. It pushes you towards simple solutions or avoidance. People experiencing acute stress often freeze or make impulsive decisions they later regret. But people who have learned to operate in uncertainty develop something called stress resilience. Their brains have learned to stay calm when faced with ambiguity. The prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for complex thinking and planning, stays active even when there's uncertainty. The amygdala fires, yes, that's normal, but it doesn't take over. Your brain learned that uncertainty is a normal state, not an emergency requiring panic. You developed this resilience over decades because you'd faced uncertainty repeatedly and survived it. The 1980s taught you that job security was fragile. The dot-com bust taught you that hype doesn't guarantee outcomes. The 2008 crisis taught you that following the rules doesn't protect you. By the time you reached your 50s, your brain had decades of evidence that you're capable of functioning in ambiguity. The pandemic happened in 2020. Something nobody had prepared for. Nobody had a playbook. Suddenly, the world shut down. Schools closed, offices closed, entire industries halted. People had to figure out how to work from home while managing their children's education, while maintaining their own mental health, all while uncertain when things would return to normal. When things might ever return to normal. For many people, especially younger people, it was a genuine crisis. How do you plan when you don't know what's coming? How do you make decisions without knowing how long this will last? How do you stay functional when everything is uncertain? Frustration was part of it, probably. Difficulty, certainly. But you didn't panic. You'd learned decades earlier that clarity doesn't arrive on schedule. You figured out what you needed to do, and you did it. You worked from your living room. You managed your kids' online school. You adapted your social life. You moved forward because you had to and because you'd learned you could. And now, in 2025, there's more uncertainty. AI is disrupting industries. Job security is evaporating. The economy is unstable. The geopolitical situation is unpredictable. The climate is changing. The future is genuinely unclear. Many people are looking for someone to tell them what to do. Some expert who will explain how to navigate this uncertain future. You have a different approach. You've learned that experts don't always know what's coming, and people who seem confident are often just performing confidence, not actually knowing more than anyone else. You've learned to watch what's actually happening and adjust based on reality, not on predictions or promises or what you hope will happen. This relates to what researchers call an internal locus of control. For many people, their sense of safety is external. They depend on institutions, experts, government, organizations to tell them they're okay. When those external sources become unreliable, they become anxious. But you've developed an internal locus of control. You trust your ability to observe, interpret, and adjust to what's actually happening. You don't need someone to tell you you're going to be okay. You know you'll figure it out. Research on adversity and growth shows that people who have faced and overcome significant challenges develop what's called post-traumatic growth. They develop increased psychological strength, deeper appreciation for life, better relationships, increased personal strength. This isn't about the trauma being good. It's that the process of navigating and surviving it builds capacity that wasn't there before. You've had repeated opportunities for this kind of growth. Every time you had to move forward without a roadmap, that built the confidence that you can handle what you don't know how to handle yet. It built the belief, proven again and again, that you figure things out. It built resilience that money can't buy and credentials can't grant. This capacity makes you valuable in times of chaos. When everything is uncertain and nobody knows what to do, you're the person that organizations and families depend on. You're not waiting for certainty. You know it won't come. You're working with the information you have and adjusting as new information arrives. Your younger colleagues sometimes watch you move through uncertainty and ask how you're not freaking out. The answer is simple. You've done this before. Not this exact situation, but this exact process. Observe, interpret, adjust, persist. You've proven to yourself over decades that you're capable of it. In your personal life, this shows up in relationships, in parenting, in aging. Your relationships don't depend on certainty. You've learned that people change, plans change. What seemed solid becomes uncertain. And you don't panic. You adjust. You talk. You figure out what matters and you recommit to it. You don't demand that your life stay static. You know it won't. You navigate the changes as they come. With your children, you've learned not to panic when they face uncertainty. You teach them to navigate uncertainty because you know that's what life requires. You've learned from your own life that uncertainty is where growth actually happens. With your own aging, you're not in denial about the changes coming. You're not pretending you can stay young or that your body will cooperate with your plans. You're aware of what's happening and you're adjusting. You're thinking about healthcare, about finances, about how you want to spend your remaining time. You're not avoiding the uncertain future. You're moving toward it with your eyes open. This is not pessimism. It's realism grounded in decades of actual experience. It's the knowledge that life doesn't move in straight lines. Plans change, people change, systems fail. But you keep functioning. You keep adapting. You keep moving forward because that's what you've learned to do. And that's a strength that becomes more valuable the more uncertain the world becomes. Chapter 6. You value what works, not what sounds good. In the 1980s, there was a powerful campaign. Just say no. It was everywhere. On billboards, in schools, in public service announcements. The message was simple and clear and morally certain. The logic was straightforward. Drugs are bad, and if you refuse them, you won't use them. Problem solved. It sounded perfect. It was easy to understand. It gave people a clear rule. It made sense. It also didn't work. Decades later, after billions of dollars spent on the campaign, after generations of children grew up hearing it, drug use rates didn't decline significantly. Some studies showed that certain drug use actually increased during the peak years of the campaign. The beautiful, simple solution to a complex problem turned out to be ineffective. The promise didn't match the outcome. You learned something from watching that unfold. You saw a lot of promises that sounded good but didn't deliver. You watched politicians make guarantees that didn't materialize. You watched economic policies fail. You watched parenting advice change. What was recommended in your childhood was suddenly considered harmful, then later came back into fashion. You watched diets promise miracles and deliver disappointment. You watched corporations make claims about their products that didn't hold up under scrutiny. And you learned to ask a simple question. But does it actually work? Not does it sound good? Does it match the narrative I want to believe? Does it make sense in theory? But in actual practice, in real life, with real people, does it actually work? That became your fundamental test. This is a form of epistemological skepticism, not cynicism. You still believe in solutions, still believe in progress, still believe things can work. But skepticism about claims that aren't tested against reality. It's the difference between what someone promises and what actually happens. Research on belief persistence and cognitive bias shows something important about how human minds work. We're pattern-seeking creatures, but we're also terrible at evaluating patterns accurately. Confirmation bias makes us notice evidence that supports what we already believe, while ignoring evidence that contradicts it. The availability heuristic makes us overweight dramatic or memorable examples. The halo effect makes us assume that if we like someone, they're right about everything. But people who grew up in an environment where they had to evaluate claims against actual results develop a different cognitive skill. They learn to test claims against reality rather than accepting them based on how they sound or who's saying them. That was your childhood. That was your education. You grew up in a time when you couldn't just Google whether something was true. You had to think about it. You had to observe reality. You had to notice. Does that person's advice actually make their life work? Does that system actually do what it claims? If not, why am I listening to it? These questions became part of how your brain works. This shows up now in how you evaluate information. You don't fall for hype the way many people do. When a new diet trend emerges promising miraculous results, you don't buy in. You've seen too many diets promise miracles and deliver nothing. You've learned that sustainable weight loss is boring and complicated and takes time. You don't expect a magic solution because you've learned that magic solutions don't exist. When a new business trend emerges, a new management philosophy, a new organizational structure, a new way of working, you're skeptical. You've seen companies implement these trends with great fanfare and watch them fail. You've seen the same basic problems persist under different names. You're not opposed to change, but you want to know. Does this actually solve the problem, or does it just sound like it does? When someone tries to convince you to buy something or believe something or do something, you have an internal detector that activates. What's the actual claim here? What evidence exists that this works? Does the evidence hold up under scrutiny? Have I seen this work in real life? Or am I just being sold a story? These questions run in the background. This makes you immune to a lot of modern manipulation. You're harder to market to because you don't buy based on narrative. You want evidence. You want to see it work. You're not swayed by celebrity endorsements or influencers or beautiful packaging. You want to know, does it actually do what it claims to do? Your younger colleagues sometimes find this frustrating. They want to implement a new strategy because it's exciting and innovative and disruptive. You ask, does it actually work better than what we're doing now? Can you show me evidence? Have we tested it? This makes you seem conservative or resistant to change. But you're not. You're just asking for reality testing before you bet your work on something. In your personal life, this shows up in how you make decisions. You don't follow fad diets. You don't believe in quick-fix self-help programs. You don't assume that the most popular option is the best option. You try things. You observe whether they work. You adjust based on what you actually experience, not on what the marketing promised. A colleague once told me about hiring someone older for a junior position. Everyone else questioned it. The candidate's resume wasn't impressive. They didn't have the latest certifications. They didn't know the newest software. But when asked how they'd handle a complex problem, they asked one question. What have you actually tried? And then they listened. They evaluated based on logic and experience, not on impressive-sounding credentials. That's you. That's how you evaluate the world. Research on what's called need for cognition, the degree to which people enjoy effortful thinking, shows that people with higher need for cognition are better at detecting bullshit. They're more skeptical of easy answers. They're more likely to dig deeper and question claims. They tend to be less susceptible to marketing and propaganda, not because they're smarter, but because they're more willing to do the work of actually thinking about things rather than accepting surface-level narratives. You've developed this through necessity. You couldn't just accept claims because they sounded good. You had to evaluate them against reality. And that habit stuck. That became how your brain works. This also changes how you talk. You don't use marketing language or hype language. You describe things as they actually are. If something is difficult, you say it's difficult. If something takes time, you say it takes time. If something might not work, you acknowledge that. You're not trying to sell anyone anything. You're just describing what's real. This can make you sound pessimistic to people who've been trained on motivational language. They expect you to frame things positively, to use language that inspires, to promise that anything is possible if you just believe hard enough. But you're not wired that way. You're wired to say, this is what's actually true and here's how we work with it. In your relationships, this means you have partners who trust what you say because you actually say what you think. You're not performing a narrative. You're not trying to convince them of something. You're just being straightforward about your perception of reality. That might not always be what they want to hear, but it's reliable, it's honest, it's real. In how you spend money, this becomes obvious. You don't buy things because they're trendy or because someone famous uses them. You don't buy the luxury version when the basic version does the same thing. You don't fall for premium pricing. You evaluate whether something is worth what it costs, and you decide based on actual use, not on the story being told about it. This makes you valuable in situations where someone needs to call bullshit. When an organization is being sold something that sounds good but won't actually solve the problem, you're the one who speaks up. Not to be contrarian, but because you've learned to distinguish between marketing and reality. And you know the difference matters. The irony is that this skepticism, this refusal to accept claims without evidence, this insistence on testing things against reality, this is what builds actual, sustainable solutions. Not the quick fix promises, not the trendy approaches, not the things that sound good. The boring, unglamorous, reality-tested solutions that actually work. You know this. You've learned it through decades of watching promises fail and workarounds succeed. You've learned that the most effective systems are often the ones nobody talks about because they work so smoothly that they're invisible. You've learned that the things that last are rarely the exciting things. They're the reliable things, the tested things, the things that work. And you trust that more than you trust anything that just sounds good. Chapter 7. You can carry more than you admit. You're 55 years old, maybe 60, maybe pushing 70. You're working full-time, or you're working and also managing a business on the side, or you're working and also taking care of your parents. Sometimes it's all of the above. Your aging parents' healthcare decisions fall to you while your adult children are still figuring out their lives. One of them needs financial help. Another needs emotional support through a divorce. Your youngest is still launching and occasionally needs to move back home. The mortgage requires your attention, just like the rising healthcare costs for both you and your parents. Your retirement savings took a hit in 2008 and still haven't fully recovered. You probably won't retire at the age you thought you would. There's uncertainty about Social Security and whether it will actually be there when you need it. Work stress follows you because your industry is changing and you're not sure how much longer your skills will be relevant. The possibility that you might lose your job to automation or to a younger, cheaper worker sits in the background. You have maybe 15 to 20 more years of productive work ahead of you, and that's a psychological weight you carry daily. Your relationship requires management, either maintaining one or navigating the complexity of being single in your 50s or 60s. Friendships have shifted because people have moved away or gotten busy or drifted. You've managed the loss of people you love. Your own aging body brings aches and pains and slowness that's creeping in. And here's what strikes me about you. You're not dramatizing it. You don't post about your stress or create a narrative about how hard your life is. Instead of demanding recognition or sympathy for what you're carrying, you stay quiet. You don't turn your struggles into your identity. You just handle it, day after day. Multiple people's needs, multiple financial obligations, your own physical and psychological needs, uncertainty about the future. You manage it all without turning it into a story. Most people, if they were carrying what you're carrying, would talk about it constantly. They would need support. They would need to process it. They would need recognition for how much they're managing. And that's not wrong. Processing difficult things is healthy. But you do it differently. You carry it quietly. You handle what's yours to handle. You don't expect someone else to solve it. You don't wait for the system to work in your favor. You adjust. You figure it out. You keep going. This capacity to carry weight without dramatizing it, to handle multiple complex responsibilities without breaking, to persist under load without turning it into suffering. This is increasingly rare, and it's increasingly valuable. Research on psychological resilience and ego strength shows that people who can function under stress without falling apart tend to have certain characteristics. They have a sense of purpose. They have internal locus of control. They believe their actions matter. They have flexibility. They can adjust their expectations and strategies when plans don't work. They have social support, though interestingly, people with very high resilience often need less social support because they have stronger internal resources. But there's something deeper than just resilience. There's a particular kind of maturity that comes from living long enough to understand that life doesn't give you what you hoped for. But it doesn't actually stop working either. You keep functioning. You keep managing. You keep showing up. Think about what you've already survived. The 1980s recession when your parents were struggling to keep jobs. Your own early career when nothing was guaranteed. The dot-com bust when entire industries evaporated. The 2008 financial crisis when you lost money and had to adjust. Maybe you've faced health crises, your own or your family's. Maybe you've faced relationship losses. Maybe you've faced professional setbacks and had to rebuild. And you're still here. You're still functioning. You're still managing. There's a reason your brain handles this so well. It relates to what researchers call executive function. The brain's ability to plan, organize, manage multiple tasks, regulate emotions, and persist toward goals despite obstacles. People with strong executive function can hold multiple competing demands in mind simultaneously. They can prioritize. They can defer gratification. They can work toward long-term goals even when short-term progress is invisible. Your brain built this through decades of practice. You've had to manage multiple demands since childhood. You've had to think ahead, plan, organize. You've had to work toward goals that took years to achieve. You've had to manage your own needs alongside other people's needs. And your brain has gotten very good at it. This shows up in how you handle crises. When something goes wrong, a health issue, a financial problem, a relationship conflict, you don't fall apart. You assess the situation. You figure out what needs to be done. You do it. You adjust other parts of your life to accommodate what's now necessary. You move forward. A woman I know is managing her mother's decline into dementia while working full-time and supporting an adult son who's struggling with addiction. She's not writing a memoir about it. She's not going on podcasts to talk about her trauma. She's scheduled her mother's doctor appointments. She's researched care facilities. She's set boundaries with her son about what she can and cannot do. She's adjusted her work schedule. She's managed her own emotional response to situations she can't control. She's persisted. That's you. Thousands of you, across the country, managing similar loads. Aging parents, launching children, work stress, financial obligations, your own aging. And you're not asking for a medal. You're just handling it. Researchers call this stress inoculation. When you face manageable levels of stress and successfully navigate them, your brain learns that you can handle stress. It builds confidence in your ability to cope. You face bigger stresses, you handle those too. Your confidence grows further. By the time you're in your 50s and 60s, you've been stress inoculated repeatedly. You know from experience that you can handle difficult things. This is different from having no stress. You're not calm because your life is easy. You're functional despite your life being complex. You're managing despite the load being heavy. And you've learned to do it without needing constant support or validation. In the workplace, this shows up as reliability. You're the person who can handle multiple projects simultaneously. You're the person who can manage a crisis without panicking. You're the person who shows up and does the work even when you're tired or stressed or dealing with personal stuff. You don't complain about the load. You just carry it. Your younger colleagues sometimes express amazement at this. How are you managing all of this? Don't you need help? Aren't you exhausted? Yes, you're probably exhausted sometimes. Yes, you probably need help sometimes. But you don't need as much as they think you should need. You've learned to manage more independently. You've learned to do things without external support. You've learned that sometimes you just do what needs to be done, whether you feel like doing it or not. In your personal life, this shows up as being the person that your family depends on. You're the one who handles things. If there's a crisis, you're there. If someone needs help, you find a way to provide it. If something needs to be managed, you manage it. You're not the loudest voice. You're not the most visible. But you're the one people actually rely on because you follow through. There's a particular kind of strength in this. It's not the strength of someone who's never been tested. It's the strength of someone who's been tested repeatedly and proven capable. It's the strength of someone who's learned that you can carry more than you think you can, and you don't die trying. You adjust. You adapt. You find ways to make it work. Research on longevity and life satisfaction shows something interesting. People who retire and completely stop working often decline faster than people who continue to have purpose and responsibility in their lives. The people who live longest and report highest life satisfaction aren't the ones with the easiest lives. They're the ones who have meaningful work, meaningful relationships, and a sense of purpose. They're the ones who are carrying something. You're carrying something, multiple somethings, and you're doing it without falling apart. That's not something to apologize for or minimize. That's something to recognize. The irony is that carrying this load, managing this complexity, persisting through this uncertainty, this is what makes you valuable. This is what makes you the backbone of families and organizations. People depend on you because they know you'll follow through. They trust you because you've proven yourself reliable. You're not the flashiest person in the room, but you're the one who makes things actually work. And here's something I want you to see clearly. You're doing this while managing the invisibility of it. Nobody gives you credit for managing your parents' healthcare decisions. Nobody celebrates that you got your adult child through their crisis. Nobody acknowledges that you're working while carrying the psychological weight of uncertainty about your future. Nobody sees most of what you're managing. But you know you're managing it. And you keep managing it. Not for recognition, not for applause, but because it needs to be managed and you're capable of managing it. That's resilience. That's strength. That's what happens when you've learned through decades of living that life requires more from you than you think you can give. And you give it anyway. Chapter 8. What this generation gave the world, and to itself. You're not a generation that celebrates itself. You're not the loudest voice in the room. You don't demand recognition or build narratives around your accomplishments. You just quietly built things. And then moved on to the next thing that needed to be built. Think about what you've actually created. Many of the key systems that the internet runs on were built by people from your generation. While the story is more complex than that. A significant portion of the engineering culture, the problem-solving approaches, the infrastructure thinking that powers the modern internet, came from people who learned to figure things out without a manual. Some of the earliest cloud computing platforms and the systems that changed how people share information emerged from engineers in your generation. That wasn't luck. That was the result of learning to think in particular ways during your childhood. But that's not really what matters for this conversation. The big accomplishments are already visible. What matters is what you gave to the world that nobody notices, because it works so smoothly that it becomes invisible. In a time when everything is chasing disruption and the next big thing, your generation maintains the systems that actually work. The lights stay on because of people like you. Infrastructure that everyone depends on runs smoothly because someone shows up day after day to do work that won't be celebrated. When something is done right, nobody notices it. That's the arrangement you've accepted. Systems that work are worth more than systems that sound exciting. You know that. You've always known that. You gave your family something specific too. You raised children in a way that was different from how you were raised. But you didn't overcompensate. You didn't try to protect them from every difficulty or guarantee them success. You raised them knowing that they would face uncertainty. You modeled for them how to function when things are unclear. You taught them, by example, that you don't need constant reassurance to do what needs to be done. In some cases, your children grew up in different circumstances than you did. They had more guidance. They had more structure. They had more people telling them they were doing the right thing. And sometimes that's created different patterns in how they approach uncertainty. Some of them look for external validation before moving forward. Some of them panic when they don't have a clear roadmap. But many of them watched you function without that constant reassurance. And they learned something real. Uncertainty is survivable. Not knowing doesn't have to mean not acting. You can figure things out as you go. That learning will ripple through their lives and eventually through the lives of the people they raise. In your workplaces, you brought something increasingly rare. Commitment to work because it matters, not because you're performing for an audience. In one office, you're the quiet person who fixed a system that was losing the company millions before anyone even knew it was broken. Nobody celebrated it. The system just worked. That's the invisible value you create. Organizations don't collapse because reliable people like you solve problems that won't make headlines. You're the backbone that nobody talks about because the backbone isn't supposed to be visible. In your communities, this shows up as action without an audience. You help your neighbor when something goes wrong because something needs to be done. Volunteer work happens because the work matters, and you volunteer because you can. Taking care of aging parents is something you accept quietly, not because recognition will come, but because they're your responsibility. Difficult relationships get maintained across decades because you understand that genuine connection is built over time, not optimized for maximum immediate satisfaction. What you've proven is this: it's possible to live a good life without constant external validation. You work hard without needing applause for it. Responsibility exists independent of recognition. Love doesn't require gratitude to be real. Ambiguity doesn't destroy you. Regrets probably exist somewhere in your past. Things you wish you could undo. Sacrifices you didn't want to make sit alongside the burdens that were heavier than they should have been. Missed moments happened because you were focused on things that had to be done. That's the cost of carrying what you've carried. But you also built something real. Resilience. Capability. The kind of character that comes from doing difficult things without expecting to be rewarded for it. Reliability that makes other people trust you. Stability that holds things together when everything else is falling apart. That's not a small thing. That's the foundation that everything else is built on. The loudest voices get attention. The people with the most followers get platforms. But the ones who actually hold things together matter more. The ones who make sure things work. The ones who do unglamorous work day after day without needing recognition. Those are the ones who matter. That's you. You're entering a phase of your life now where stepping back would make sense. You've earned it. You've carried things. You've done the work. It would be reasonable to decide that it's someone else's turn to be responsible, someone else's turn to solve problems. But I suspect you won't. Because by now, being responsible is just who you are. It's not something you do for recognition. It's not something you do because you expect gratitude. It's simply part of how you move through the world. The world needs people who show up when nothing requires them to. People capable of handling ambiguity without falling apart belong in it. Someone has to understand that reliability matters more than excitement, and that someone is you. The kind of person who does difficult things without dramatizing them is increasingly rare, increasingly essential. That's what your generation gave to the world. Big innovations get celebrated elsewhere. Your contribution is steadier. Systems that function, stability created in a world that pulls everything apart. Proof that a good life is possible while doing the work that needs to be done. And that matters because it is real, regardless of whether anyone sees it.